Hello and welcome to my podcast. In this podcast, I am going to discuss development strategy. So, in a way, I'm going to look at the budget and what went below it, before it, and put it into a development policy strategy and give you a perspective on how this broader framework has changed. So I will start by discussing development strategy and how it has changed. Put it into the context of policy evolution since 2014-15. Uh, talk briefly about the pandemic and its effect on this issue, how the government's approach, attitude, and policy has changed, and then come to the actual policy reforms which took place, the key ones before the budget, and policy reforms in the budget, of which the big idea is clearly privatization, but I will also mention briefly public health, where there is some very interesting thing happened. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit about what is still remains to be done with respect to the tax and transfer system if we are to really have a modern middle income country. And I'll end with some brief discussion on the economic recovery and the risks still remaining, risk to faster growth. Development strategy. So, in my view, there is a fundamental change in economic development strategy. I would say this is the second giant step after the first one, which was stretched over the 90s. Of course, there it was front loaded. Here I would contrast it by saying it's kind of middle loaded. So we've seen something happen before. Now the budget has happened, and I expect more things to be done. One of which I mentioned in the overview. Before this transformation is complete. But the way I describe this transformation is the movement from a bureaucratic socialism to a modern welfare state. What does this involve? Concretely, it incorporates a redefinition of the role of government / bureaucrats vis-a-vis the private enterprise and entrepreneurs. So there is a recognition that government has to create conditions for faster growth and social welfare, while entrepreneurs have to generate the productive jobs, wealth, and revenues on the basis of which government carries out the activities mentioned in the earlier point. And all this, for it to be successful, requires accelerated GDP growth. That growth is the key to better living conditions. Successful completion of the transformation also requires, as I suggested earlier, a modern tax and welfare transfer system, which is suited to India and its middle income economy. We can't just borrow things. Earlier we tried to borrow things from Marxist countries. Now many people are saying we should just borrow the discussion and the suggestions which are being made in developed countries and just take them over. I think that's fundamentally wrong. And I'll just give you an idea of what, to me, this tax and welfare transfer system will look like. And this is common to most modern countries, and does not depend or vary with the level of income, which is you need a professional modern regulatory system. Very important. Policy evolution since 2014-15. So in the beginning, initial moves when the government came in, we saw initial moves in the first 2 years. There was talk of government has no business to be in business, minimum government, maximum governance, which raised a lot of hopes. And some actions were actually taken. For example, the IBC, the Indian Bankruptcy Code, was truly a great step. The GST a big constitutional step, but weaknesses in implementation, and this whole concept of auctions for auctioning spectrum for resources, oil and coal, because that is really the only way in which the price of those can be and it can be objectively be done. The DBT, the Aadhaar, the Jan Dhan accounts, the PM Kisan, which is a direct cash transfer system, all these were moves towards what I have just said is the ultimate objective. And of course, a much greater emphasis on digital India, e-governance, GEM, the design of the UPI FinStack. Not that this is the first time either of these two things had been thought of for the first time, but really a much more focused and determined implementation of these things. However, there was a setback in the next 3 years, from 2016 to 17, 2016-17 to 2018-19. Those 3 years, I would say, were a period of setback. Why? Because we began to get echoes of Indira Gandhi's bureaucratic socialism, the point I made about bureaucratic socialism earlier, and a much too larger focus on criminalization, demonetization, higher taxes, protection, the kind of things we had seen in spades during Indira Gandhi's development of bureaucratic socialism. However, fortunately, some rethinking, re-evaluation, reorientation of economic policy started thereafter at some point. And I date that really the first signal we got from outside was in June 2019. So for roughly the second term of the current government, which started in end of May, we seem to have got this rethinking, reevaluation and reorientation. Then pre-pandemic, the pandemic events and so on had an effect on this thinking in the next year. So pandemic then came in, and this was both a crisis and an opportunity. Here we must remember that the lockdown we started towards the end of March and lasted for roughly 6 weeks or a little more, shut down 60% of the economy, which had 40% of the total employment, which generated or provided 45% of the employment. Now, what the pandemic did is it magnified trends. There were certain trends in operation, and we take note of these because these are important from where we went from there. Among these were the supply chain diversification, which the US previous president had kind of set in motion. The diversification of supply chain from China to India got accentuated because of the disruptions which pandemic imposed on these supply chains. So greater thinking, greater attention to supply chain diversification resulting from this crisis. This was both a crisis and an opportunity. Then the digitization, contagion fears, accelerated e-commerce, working from home, etc. Again, a trend which had been going on all across the world, but less in India. And it certainly gave a big boost to this trend in India and has accelerated. And there are some areas where actually we will pioneer. For example, e-education, e-medicines, certainly there's a big boost in India. And the work from home, the whole work from home movement, which actually has even greater relevance for us, because work from home also means you can work from a village, home in a village, or a home in a third tier town. So in principle, somebody sitting in a small town in India can work for the biggest corporations in the US. So a crisis and an opportunity. Health focus. We've always been good at pharmaceutical products, etc. But there is an opportunity of becoming pharmacy of the world. Now, so how did the government of India see this? And the interesting thing is, though we were afraid that government would not see this, but I think government quite rightly saw this crisis as an opportunity for bold economic reforms. And these really leaving aside the things which had happened before the pandemic, the first hints of this started coming, and the first action really was, among the first, was in June of 2020. So underlying all this, and I want to take a little time on this, is a change in attitude, approach, and policy. So let me quickly go one by one over these things. Go one by one over each of these. So change in attitude, openness to economic information and knowledge. By June of 2019, I was getting the feeling that government is really not interested in hearing me, hearing my experience, learning from my 25 to 30 years of experience in economic reforms and economic growth. But this attitude seemed to change, and the break, as far as I could see, came in September 2019 with the announcement of corporate tax reform to 25% after 5 years of very slow work, and the more surprising, the attempt to attract manufacturing supply chains with a 15% tax rate for manufacturing for the next 3 years. So from complete closing off from June 29, a greater openness to advice. This is what I saw in the last quarter of the year 2019, post the CIT reforms. An extensive series of external consultations seemed to start, and included. So I felt encouraged to convey our own experience of growth and reforms in the last quarter of 2019, as I indicated, and talk on the economic reform lessons to key secretaries at NITI. So I got an opportunity to go to NITI and talk to key secretaries, and I outlined what is the importance, how to go about it, and these are summarized in an EGROW policy paper which came out in Jan 2020. So if you read this growth, slowdown, reforms and economy, you can get an idea of the kind of things I was talking about. What about the change in approach? From my perspective, the approach changed from looking excessively backward looking to becoming more forward looking. So what was the backward looking approach which I'm talking about? There seemed to have been was a tinge of protectionism and nostalgia developing, which was the Make in India was a reflection of this. Up to the interim budget of 2019, one had uncomfortable echoes of past. People talked about protectionism, as I said, and the tax rise, incremental tax rises, etc. But one has to be careful in not over projecting it. The IMF study has shown that average tariffs increased by only 1.5% point between 2014 and 19. So over those entire 5 years, a rise of 1.5%. So that is why I call it a tinge of protectionism. But the attitude, the approach seemed to be moving towards that direction, even though the actual change may not have been that much. Atmanirbhar Bharat. So we moved in the new term from Make in India before to Atmanirbhar Bharat. And what is the difference? Well, we don't see any rollback of these higher tariffs, but I think that why I'm emphasizing the approach and attitude is that this self-reliance, the word also reflects self-reliance based on greater confidence in domestic reform, because that is really the key. We won't have Atmanirbhar Bharat unless we have domestic reforms, and I see recognition or a beginning of a recognition that domestic reforms will help us become more self-reliant. And also there is a greater clarity about the goal of making India a modern, fast-growing welfare economy. This is a change in approach. Again, a greater understanding of the link between the economic goals that need to be achieved and the policies needed to achieve them. And finally, linking back to our broader point before, a clearer view on the role of government vis-a-vis the private sector and private entrepreneurs. So greater clarity on these types of issues. greater clarity on those type of issues. Now, okay, so one could say it's fine to talk about attitude and approach, but where is the beef, as they say? That's a wrong word, but what about the policy change? What are the concrete policy changes? So I'll start with pre-budget and give you a very brief overview of those, and then move to the budget. So what we saw was this reflecting this change in attitude and approach, that earlier the policies seemed to be driven by more about moral goals, and so they began to move towards greater focus on productivity, competitiveness, and growth. They also began, I gave you a hint of moral goals in terms of criminalization of certain activity, etc. But from economic perspective, how do we say this productivity, competitiveness, growth? One set of reforms was to move from government monopoly to introduce private competition. This has happened in coal, oil, defense, space, atomic energy. All these happened, from June onwards. They were announced in a series of announcements over 2020 to 21. The second one was the new educational policies, including medical. Again, this has been in the year for several years, but the key, there are many issues. Some of them may still be not fully developed, but the key element here was to encourage private and foreign entry. This does not mean that the public educational system will go away. They will always remain. But some element of regulated competition is very important, particularly in higher areas of education, technical education, etc. And the budget seemed to also give a signal that the government is willing to put its money where its mouth is. It announced the Higher Education Commission, the National Science Foundation, and set up a research fund. So focusing on improving the upper levels of the education system, where the central government has a greater role. In the lower areas, really the system is controlled by, exists at the state level. So they have a much greater role. So the central government has to focus on the upper elements, including research and development. The third one was, of course, the three agricultural laws. Enough has been said about this, and I don't want to go back into this. I just want to list them. Labor codes. Again, not only did government combine 29 central laws into 4, but it has also proceeded to draw up the rules, and draw up the rules not by itself in a legalistic manner, but is discussing with stakeholders on what is the precise element, if something needs to be changed, how to make it operational, both to ensure that labor is protected, but also that the flexibility which these codes are designed to produce will actually happen. Then another one was the Electricity Amendment Bill. Again, the government has made previous efforts about it. A year or two ago, a bill was introduced, but it was reintroduced. Plus, government then in the budget took actions to incentivize. The basic problem is that private sector has been introduced into competition in production quite early and effectively, though there were a lot of hiccups. The transmission part is doing well, but distribution, because it's entirely under the states, there has been very difficult. Tens of committees have been appointed to see how to take it forward. When I was in Planning Commission, I even headed one of these committees, but despite all our efforts, we have not been successful. And so government is making another effort to make sure to give consumers choice, which is the essence of competition and distribution, and also to try and make sure that the excessive fees which are charged to industry, which hinder job creation, industrial growth in the states are harmed, they don't realize. And it's trying to incentivize the DISCOM, and for this it's announced certain things in the budget. And then, of course, again, the strategic industry policy was announced, but the details were not given well before the budget. And I welcomed it because it's the first time ever this would provide a framework for privatization. We will have more to say on this when we come to the budget. So, budget 2021. So what were the steps? The biggest step, of course, was that framework which I just mentioned, a clear framework which has been defined, was made more concrete by actually announcing privatization. And in a sense, this was the big bang in this budget, because really nobody was expecting this huge amount of privatization. So why do I say huge? Okay, the two private sector bank privatization announced in the budget is really a revolutionary step, because the Bank Nationalization Act of 1969, a 50-year-old act which every government since then has been afraid to touch, will have to be amended to make this possible. So it's a big change. IDBI privatization also announced. So it's not just isolation, just the mention of two banks, but other things. There was also something on PSP, regulatory risk. Regulations are very important for public, for banking and finance, and certain things connected to that. Insurance privatization. Their government owns 4 different general insurance companies, and a budget announced one of these 4 will be privatized. Then LIC disinvestment, which has actually been there in earlier budgets, was reiterated, but this time I think with greater seriousness. Monetization of public goods. This is not as big a thing as the privatization which I've mentioned, but it also shows that the areas where the government will continue to have a role which are difficult to privatize, the government finances, it needs more financing, and therefore this new method of systematically monetizing public goods infrastructure wherever possible, and the land which is lying unused, to finance more infrastructure projects, so accelerate the infrastructure development through monetization. Skilling, Apprenticeship Act, for the last 3 years, including this one, in which I have been invited by FM to give my views. I've been arguing for the role of Apprenticeship Act in improving learning by doing and skilling. So finally that was accepted, and it was announced in the budget. Capital expenditure increase, very important. Again, lots of economists over the last year have been saying that the best way to stimulate the economy post-pandemic is through increase in capital expenditure, infrastructure spending, and so on. So 34.5% BE to BU increase will be important for jobs and demand. I'll come back briefly to it later. And infrastructure, the transport elements like and logistics, the DFC is a very important initiative, which the 2 of the freight corridors will be completed by June. 4 more are envisaged in the next 4 years. This will have a transformational effect on transport from the hinterland to the coast, and speed up its development. And then, of course, digital is very important. We talked about the lessons or the trends from the pandemic. So further on BharatNet, a faster development, Vani was announced. All these things will help promote digitalization. Public health I mentioned briefly because it's very important, and the Swachh Bharat Mission Urban. The budget announced liquid waste, fecal sludge management. Governments, people don't like to talk about this, but I welcome such things being referred to in the budget, because it shows that recognition of their importance. Things like bioremediation of garbage dumps. Again, a normal average person doesn't like to think about it, but I think it's very important. And I'll tell you how. A universal water supply. Now, all these are going to be critical. And I want to mention here something called environmental enteropathy, which research has shown is a very important element of stunting and wasting. Most people think of, oh, children don't have enough food, they don't get enough nutritional food, but what I found in my research is that this particular disease, which is connected to unclean sewage, sanitation, dirty water, has a large role in stunting and wasting. So this mission, I believe, is very, very important for having impact on the stunting and wasting that happens in slum areas, where sewage flows over, dirty water overflowing during the monsoons. If you ever visit, you would know. And then, of course, other aspects, vaccination program, which is of course very important, but the recognition which has come that some of the methods like masks, hand cleaning, distancing can also help control other airborne diseases like TB. So I think that will have a important collateral benefit now that as government has recognized and the health structure has recognized this silver lining. One thing missing I want to mention is that I had recommended for the budget incentive for virus quality filters and UV lights, which are going to be critical. I'll come back to that why, but I want to mention it here. And then institutional strengthening also in the budget, National Center for Disease Control, Regional Research Center in cooperation with WHO. These will all improve the public health system. Health portal, having all the central and state programs, very important decision, and also a precursor to something which I'll recommend later. And district hospitals, strengthening of district hospital with the lessons learned from the COVID. So with that overview about this change, I think I've given you a flavor of the change from bureaucratic socialism towards a modern welfare system. Has two elements. It has competitive private markets for goods, products, services, for factors, labor, capital, etc. But there is still one thing missing. Modernizing the whole economy requires a modern tax and transfer system, and I'll just give you a flavor of what that involves. Firstly, it involves tax reform. This is important not only is particularly important to provide a level playing field for MSMEs. Number of people have noticed that they don't see too many things which will aid the MSMEs, in the budget. And tax reform is key to this. That requires GST reform and simplification, but here the GST Council is critical, and the FMS said that she will try to take up some of these issues with the GST Council, so that is encouraging. Direct tax code, there was no mention in the budget, but hopefully by the next budget something will be done about it, because it's very, very critical to a modern tax and transfer system. Our tax code is too complicated, too big, and not makes things life very difficult for MSMEs. Customs, similar rate structure, exemptions. Again, there's a small hint in the budget, but nothing really much more, comprehensive and thoughtful reform is needed to modernize our tax system. Welfare reform and the whole poverty alleviation system. I have mentioned before that the last time I researched, there was something like 250 to 350 programs of the central and state governments at the district level. Impossible to implement so many programs for one district collector, who is the main in charge and operational manager of these things. So what do we need? Basically, there are three elements. I'll just mention them here. One is what I call a welfare stack. This is kind of like the health stack which I referred to, which the government is proposing, but it would have all these welfare programs which I mentioned to you, which are focused on poverty alleviation, lower income people, central and state governments. So will be on the welfare stack so that everybody knows what these are. The second one is a virtual integrated smart card. I had proposed a solid smart card in 2009, but now with this digitalization, etc., which we have discussed, and the big opportunities, it can be virtual. It can be in that stack. So what's important about it? It means that every individual who is poor or vulnerable will be able to see exactly what program they are entitled to, and government and NGOs will be able to ensure that they get what they are entitled to. So very important. Each person will have this information, and people who want to help him or her will be able to help. And finally, the third element, which I have been emphasizing for a long time, more than 10-15 years, is a direct cash transfer system, or a DBT mobile. Mobile because it gives flexibility. If it is based on a mobile phone, this welfare system in a way goes with you wherever you are. And we are all stable, we are middle class, we don't move so much, but some of the poor have to move a lot, and they have to be separated from their families. So if each of them, including a husband, wife, so that when they are separated, they had in a sense, the welfare system on their phone, it would hugely transform, it will empower them and transform our welfare system. And eventually, perhaps after both these things are well in place, a few years after that, an integrated system which I called a net income transfer or a negative income tax system. But that's for the future. But the key point here is that these are elements which I have reflected on for decades and decades, and designed to suit India and the low middle income country which we are now. Of course, hopefully in the next 5 years or so we'll become a middle income country, but still we are not a high income country. So in my view, the people want to bring systems which are being discussed there, they are completely unsuitable to our conditions. And finally, what does this all mean for GDP growth and jobs? Now, to start with the current year, which is still not over, which will end at the end of March, the FY 21, which is 2021 year, GDP growth rate is expected to be between -8% and -7.5%. Perhaps with a little upside in my view, but the CSO has said -8%. I have been saying that it won't be less than -7.5%. So what about jobs? So I have used CMI data, and I'm going to give you a hint of this. So the good news is that the unemployment rate in January and February is now much less. That means much better than it was in January and February a year ago. And the second good news is the aggregate employment as measured by CMIE, not my estimate, not the government or NSS estimate, but by CMIE, which many people have used earlier in the last 3-4 years to criticize the government, shows that aggregate employment in January 21 this year was higher than it was 2 years ago. So if you believe this data, the aggregate level is now recovered not just the pandemic issue, but also the year in which the growth rate declined to 4%. But this doesn't mean that everything is great and there are no problems. There are distributional issues. I just want to note them here. So what are the negative distributional effects of the pandemic? I believe they are temporary, but we should note them and try to remove them as soon as possible, definitely. So female labor force participation rate, I estimate, is down by about 0.5% points. Now the LFPR overall had gone down because of the pandemic by about 2% points. So about 3/4 of this has already recovered, okay, as we stand today. But the remainder, the problem seems to be concentrated on women, which is very sad and unfortunate, because so my explanation for this, and it's a very tentative one, there's not enough data, there's only little fragments of information on which I base this, but what my judgment is that the fear of pandemic, the schools being closed, and women hesitating to go out because there were not that great opportunities, of course everything was weak, they started staying home and doing the cooking. And given that their income was lower, they also either dispensed with their help, like cooks, etc. Many of them happen to be women, but cut down on their use of home workers. So there was a double whammy, which has affected women, because if you are a housewife, from leave a job and come back to the house, that is not counted as work. So that would be counted as not being in the labor force. Okay, so that I believe is one problem, and the second one is that some workers have been informalized. So regular employment, they had regular pay. That doesn't mean a big job, but for example, we all know that many permanent employees which we have, cooks or house workers, if they are full time, they get a regular salary. That they are counted as regular jobs, salary, not corporate job, but a regular job. And so some of these have been informalized. And the third part of my intuition is that most of this, and this is more than intuition, is linked to contact services which have not recovered. What are contact services? It includes trade, transport, hotels, restaurant, personal services, which are still badly affected. They are not recovered. So anybody who worked in these, the owners even, or indirectly the inputs which were used, for example, in marriage parties, lots of drinks, both alcoholic, non-alcoholic, all those are also suffering connected to this. This constitutes about 10 to 15% of total GDP and employment, but it's much more visible. If you go out, if you travel, or go to a market, trade, transport, hotels, restaurant, if you used to go to marriages, you go to any of these things, you see that it has not recovered. So it looms much larger. But if you look at the statistics, it's just constitute 10 to 15%. That doesn't mean we should accept this, but we have to focus on what the possible solutions are. And I have given one important thing, that this requires, of course, vaccination. It requires accelerated vaccination, but also what we could have done was to incentivize both the states and the union government, incentivize the installation of virus quality filters and UCV lights in public bathrooms, etc., closed small spaces. Unfortunately, this recommendation of mine has been missed. And finally, the growth rebound going forward. So next year, I was one of the first economists or financial analysts to say that we can expect double-digit growth in next year. There is, of course, the issue of fiscal deficit and debt, but the only way to solve this is to higher growth for the future over the next 10 years. And I do not believe, that this will cause crowding out or inflation for various reasons, because reform accelerates growth. Growth draws in capital from all over the world, which will ensure that there is no crowding out. And similarly, inflation. Globally, I think the more serious problem is deflation, because aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. So personally, I'm not that worried about it, but of course, some people say there are risk of it. What about private consumption and investment? In Q3, investment actually has recovered to the levels of a year ago, not to the levels of 2-3 years ago, but to the levels of, but consumption, private consumption has not even recovered to what it was last year, in Q3 of last fiscal year, compared to the Q3 of this year. So clearly there's an issue here. And one of them is what I already told you about contact services, vaccination, air filters, etc. But the second most important one, the most important actually, is what 90% of economists had agreed on, that government needs to step up investment. So the 34.5% BE to BE increase in capital expenditure is critical to this. But I should elaborate that many people think of it only as a supply side measure. It's not a supply side measure. It immediately, the construction, many infrastructure sectors where this investment is going to increase are construction intensive. Highways, many initial expenditures on railway things. So, and many others, ports, etc. So they immediately stimulate jobs of the common worker, the average worker, and stimulate demand. So this is going to be very important for pulling up. These two factors are going to be important in pulling up whoever has been left out from the recovery, which I told you in aggregate appears very good, but they are these seriously deficient pockets. And finally, on the overall reforms, pre-budget, budget, and what we hope to get in the next 12 months or so, what one could call the big bang reforms in GDP, I expect overall that as a result of these, average growth will rise above 7%, say between 7 and 8% during the next decade of 2021 to 30. but what are the risks which need to be watched by the government? Because we know that there are two or three things which we know from reform. One is lags. There are always lags, differing lags between the reform and the effect on growth which you expect from that reform. Okay. Of course, we have learnt that part of this depends on the design of the reform, and we have learnt that some of the GST design, etc., was not good enough to elicit the full response. So one has to be very careful in designing all the reforms that I mentioned carefully. And I gave you an indication that as far as labor reforms are concerned, government is making sure that the rules are consistent, that any little problems which they have not seen properly, that they are ironing out before implementing these rules. And it's very important. That is the first step. The second is to make sure the government to monitor what is the effect, to make sure to enhance. There may be some things which we have not thought of because it requires a lot of detail. It's easy for a person like me to lay out the big picture, the big reform, but one has to follow it up to make sure there are no detailed aspects which are delaying the effect of these reforms, and make sure that they actually pass through into actual action in investment and growth. That is one. The second, as many people have pointed out and worried about, is conflicts. Social, excessive political conflict, violence. Those are things, every country has to worry because the rule of law is critical to high economic growth, fast economic growth. And what the lessons which I have learned from studying is that conflict resolution institutions are very important. So even if there is a conflict, if you resolve it effectively and so to say get rid of it, or control it, or after the fact leave everybody quietened down, then it does not affect the growth rate. So what does that mean? I'm not an expert on political institutions, etc., but two or three things come to mind. One is parliament. It's in a democracy, it's a center of debate. So the parliament must be effective, must be made. One must invest in using parliament for resolving conflicts. The second thing, which given that center-state issues are beginning to rise, of course, now we have a GST council where issues connected with GST can be resolved, but for several other issues, the interstate council used to be there. Now, whether we use the interstate council or set up a new mechanism, we need an institution for resolving center-state conflicts. And finally, the legal system. The last manifesto of the BJP in the national election recognized the importance of legal reform. But frankly, there's no harm in reiterating. We need a comprehensive reform of the legal system, end to end, starting from many laws, going through the police, the prosecution, the judicial, the courts, the prisons. We need a reform of this whole system because it's a way of dampening conflicts. Conflicts multiply when there's violence and the other side doesn't feel they've got full justice. So the justice system, the legal system is very important. For if everybody has a faith that the legal system will function, things happen. We can't have a world free of murder, rape, and so on. But what is important is that if enough people are prosecuted and convicted and put in jail, then people have faith in the system. Then conflicts die down. They can be controlled more easily. So let me end with that. People have accused me of being optimistic, and therefore it was very important to put in the risk. But overall, as I said before, I am reasonably confident that growth rate over the next decade, India can, with the measures which I have mentioned, the remaining reforms, we can push up India's growth, GDP growth to between 7 and 8%. Thank you.